an occasional video game scriptwriter, narrative designer and stuff as well. And I'm here launching my new book, Shadow of the Serpent, which is the third in the Monju Cthulhu series. I do two sort of main series, Monju Cthulhu, which is Napoleonic Cthulhu, and the other series is called the Seraph Chronicles, which is mainly World War II, but kind of buzzes around through history. And that's about a guy who's a sort of eternal champion for mankind against the forces of the mythos. So I thought what I'd do perhaps is just read you the prologue of this, and then I'll take questions on writing, game design, and whatever you like really, but probably they're the areas of expertise. So I shall start right away because we're running a little bit late. So we're in Egypt, Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1797, I think. And this is Shadow of the Serpent's prologue. Beneath a hunter's moon, the nightjar's reedy crawl trailed across the open desert, echoing on the shifting sands, although not a breath of wind disturbed the dusk. Shirtless men sweated, bending their backs, putting their combined muscle behind a huge wooden lever. There was the sound of splintering, then a mighty heave, a final exertion, and the load-bearing stone gave way, toppling down the crumbling sides of the ziggurat to come to rest 20 metres below. White teeth flashed beneath drooping black moustaches, eyes wide with triumph, as they wiped sweat from their pale, weary bodies. In a sky stained blood red, the last rays of the failing sun stole into the Stygian gloom behind the newly revealed portal, but failed to penetrate beyond the threshold, as if the blackness had swallowed them whole. From out of the steps, a faint smell emerged, stale and fetid, like the lost breath of the long centuries, air that had not been exhaled in millennia. Merde, the tallest of the men remarked, drawing a handkerchief from his breeches and wrapping around his nose and mouth. The others followed his example and then began to apply tinder and flint, torches sparking into resinous life. Hastily pulling shirts and white and blue jackets onto battle-scarred bodies, they thrust swords and pistols into their belts and shouldered their tools and kit. They all looked to the tall man, whose jacket bore 3 vertical chevrons. "Let us become rich men then, mes amis," he said, grinning, then strode towards the entrance. Half a dozen followed in an eager huddle. But 2 held back, darker skinned and clad in desert robes, and began muttering and making strange signs with intertwined fingers. The tall man ignored them as he ushered the others into a long tunnel which stood revealed by the flickering torchlight. "Not you, Bastien. Wait here. Keep an eye out for any who would interfere with our mission." But, protested the young soldier, but it was to no avail. An unyielding expression remained on the tall man's face, and suddenly an iron hand gripped the younger's shoulder. Grizzled tones insisted, though not unkindly. "Understand, it is to you I entrust this special duty, this position of honour. Guard the doorway with your life. Keep our means of retreat secure." Disappointment, a flush of anger flared on the younger man's face, but gave way to reluctant acceptance. He nodded, shouldered his musket, and took up his post. "Oui, sergeant." Inside, the passageway sloped steeply downward, and the sergeant brushed past his comrades to take the lead. The ceiling was low for a man of his size, and he had to stoop awkwardly, crabbing along, thrusting the flickering torch ahead of him. The dust, which had lain undisturbed down the long eons, was flung up by his boots, eddying into small flurries, the cobwebs crackling before the naked flame. The stone corridor seemed to go on forever, the shadows lengthening ahead of him, capering as he advanced deeper into the heart of this solemn edifice. Temperature plummeted as if they were entering into another realm beneath the dominion of the surface world, and the sergeant gave a sympathetic shiver, unconsciously touching the twin pistols at his belt. Just as he began to suspect that this tunnel must lead into the very bowels of hell itself, the torchlight revealed an arch ahead, framing the entrance to a larger chamber. The archway was framed by a strange dark stone, and on the keystone a highly cursive script seemed to glow and dance in the torchlight. Yet its threshold seemed organic, membranous even, dark and fluid and translucent as obsidian, obscuring what lay beyond. The language was unfamiliar, its meaning lost down the dusty centuries, but even to the sergeant's prosaic eye it looked ominous, prohibitive, a warning across the distance of ages. And so say all who will protect their shroud-wrapped treasures with curses. But words will not stall us now, nor deflect us from our purpose, said the sergeant, sensing the hesitancy which gripped his men. He raised his voice, a familiar tone of command that cut through the sepulchral silence. Courage, mon brave. Would you, who have so soundly beaten the Emperor's enemies across the world's battlefields, be afraid of shadows? He strode forward, the torch held high, and as he passed through the viscous matter of the archway, his body seemed to warp and shimmer, twisting and elongating, a most unpleasant, disconcerting sensation. But then he was through and into the chamber beyond with no ill effects, and beckoning his men with an audacious grin. Putting aside their trepidation, the soldiers followed, and soon they were all assembled in the chamber. It was as if they had stepped into another realm entirely, for what greeted them was a hemispherical chamber where a blurry green light held sway, as if they had entered some dream state. Bleached walls were covered in blocks of hieroglyphs, and in between these esoteric scripts there were colourful images of strange animal-headed deities in solid, earthy hues of blue and ochre, crowns and garments picked out in gold leaf. Funerary urns groaned with coin, and treasure heaps of precious stones were piled up on the floor. Arranged in regimented symmetrical patterns were squadrons of shabdi, funerary figurines which blended elements of human and alien physiology into contorted, suggestive shapes. One entire wall was smothered in a sea of scrolls, dusty, bone-dry pages untouched by the passage of time, nestling in their niches. It was a hoard that glittered with wealth, splendour, and a myriad of possibilities, a trove that would have satisfied even the most avaricious pharaoh. The guardsmen swore softly, taking in these opulent spoils, but at another nod from the sergeant they began filling knapsacks and bags with the most readily portable treasures. The sergeant, however, had eyes for only one object, a large sarcophagus which stood propped against the back wall, overlooking the chamber like a sentinel. Leaving his men to the work, he strode across and looked the object up and down, entranced by its siren call. It was a formidable casket, some 8 feet tall, hewn from obsidian-like rock, but smooth as marble and shot through with golden threads which danced before his eyes. Entranced, he reached out to touch its surface, but a sudden misgiving, some buried instinct intervened, and his eyes slid away from its surface, drawn instead to the frescoes which flanked it. The one on the left depicted a gigantic snake, its golden coils curled in circles of 8, exotic, mesmerizing spirals which lurked beneath the surface of an ocean of night. Venomous fangs dripped with poison, and its forked tongue and glinting eyes waited to strike a falcon-headed god, sailing on a bark which drew a golden orb behind it. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, contemplating this depiction of the primal creation myth, but then he shrugged and moved on to the other artwork. This fresco was less abstract and more naturalistic, showing a series of scenes which linked together to form a narrative. A long procession snaked towards a great pyramid in a scene of triumph as a warrior pharaoh in a gilded chariot and his entourage approached the opposing edifice. Crowds watched, but the pharaoh and his followers ignored them completely as he ascended to the entrance, climbing the steps before descending into the darkness. Deep in the bowels of the tomb, shut away from the light, amidst a pall of burning incense, priests and acolytes chanted as the pharaoh was interred into a huge sarcophagus, a great glittering jewel set on his forehead. Its amethyst beams radiated in the darkness before the priests sealed him away forever. It was a scene no doubt familiar to the savants who accompanied the emperor's expedition and were acquainted with ancient funerary rites. Yet even the sergeant's prosaic eye caught the outre and unusual details in the tableau. The attendant crowd was dressed in the typical peasant garb of ancient Egyptians. but the priests, guards, and the pharaoh himself bore the mark of serpentes, snake-headed creatures who had been skillfully rendered so that an observer could distinguish between individual species like cobra, python, and asp. Merde. So it is as the old rogue said, the sergeant whispered to himself. The legend of the snake priests. It is true. He stepped back to regard the sarcophagus again, its obsidian surface smooth and flawless. Yet now, as he began to discern the subtle lines of the ornate, stylized death mask etched into its stable exterior. For a moment he hesitated again, loath to disturb anything within this tomb of the ancients. No, he told himself, it was just myth and superstition designed to instill fear which would deter the living from claiming its treasures for themselves. What use had the dead for such riches? Their eyes could not gaze upon its beauty. Their withered bodies could not appreciate its comforts. Their minds could not enjoy the pleasures it might bestow. Wine, women, a life of ease away from the bloody battlefields that were the soldier's lot. And why not? Why shouldn't he claim this treasure, even if it meant shattering the rest of a long-dead pharaoh? Resolved, the sergeant took his bayonet, and feeling gingerly for a seam in the casket's facade, he inserted the blade and began to apply pressure, so intent on his task that the effort fully absorbed him. The lid began to shift a fraction, and, with another grunt, he twisted the blade again, jimmying a space so that he could thrust his fingers in. Gaining a finger hold, he strained and heaved, exerting every sinew of his brawny arms, pitting the strength of his battle-tempered frame against the ancient object. With a final great heave, he wrenched it off, and it fell with a resounding crash. A pungent odour flooded his nostrils, a mix of bitter herbs and sweet-smelling oils. Peering inside, the sergeant saw a tall figure swathed in dark wrappings. Yet this was no rotten shroud, no collection of crumbling bones, but an imposing, unsullied form, looking as fresh as it had been just entombed just yesterday. Scaly, muscular arms were crossed over a broad chest, long serpentine fingers curled around sword and scythe. Its head was unclothed, and an eerie echo of the casket's exterior, bearing the flat head, bulging cheeks, and gimlet eyes of an adder, although whether this was an elaborate death mask or the creature's true face, he could not tell. At its throat was a medallion bearing an oribus, a snake swallowing its own tail, and on its forehead, set on a circlet made of twisted bands of fine gold, was a huge purple jewel, an amethyst rhombus with facets that danced with threads of purple fire, glittering with a dark internal life. Entranced, unthinking, the sergeant stood up on his toes, fingers stretched towards this great treasure, and as the tips grasped the band, his palms brushed its temples as he sought to ease the crown off the creature's head. The coronet moved a fraction, and then below his eye line there was a trace of movement, and he felt the faintest disturbance of the air. A powerful blow assailed him, hurling the sergeant metres across the intervening space, and he blacked out for a moment, for the next thing he knew he was lying on his back. He came to his senses, chest on fire, grasping for air for lungs which had been emptied and still ached from the shocking jolt. Merde, they're coming out of the walls! He heard the guardsman behind him shout, but his attention was focused on the gigantic figure which now advanced towards him. Grunting, he rolled and came up onto his knees, whipping twin pistols from his belt, and in one smooth motion discharged them at the creature. Both balls sped towards their intended target, but sword and scythe flashed in a blur of motion, cleaving the missiles in two, so that they dropped into halves onto the floor. Undaunted, the sergeant drew his sword, feinted once, and then launched a savage stroke at the creature's head. But its own sword rose to parry it, and then the scythe sang, striking his sword hand off neatly at the wrist. He stared in shock at the bleeding stump, but before he could react, a lancing pain engulfed him. A streak of hot fire shot through his bowels. The thing had impaled him, lifting him bodily into the air, inflicting searing agonies as it drew him closer. bringing his face up to its own. He tried to grasp for his bayonet with his remaining hand, determined to inflict some hurt on it even with his dying breath. But the tongue flickered, fangs glistening as it whispered, "In the name of Apep, Lord of Chaos, awaken." So fast the eye could barely follow, the scythe reaped its grim harvest, and the sergeant's head bounced wetly as it rolled along the flagstones of the crypt and came to a rest. The sergeant's moustaches still quivered with a faint motion, but his glassy, unseeing eyes, now devoid of life, reflected the scenes of utter carnage as the slaughters of his brothers continued unabated. There you go. That's the beginning. So yeah, that's the beginning of Shadow of the Serpent. A little prologue to give you a little teaser of the main story. Any questions about that or other series or game design, writing? I'll take anything.
What was the first RPG you ever loved?
Oh, well, I suppose like D&D, I'm afraid it was the Red Box D&D. It's the classic answer, isn't it? But I remember a guy bringing that into school and I was like, he lent it to me and I read it. I just could not stop reading. It was so amazing to me that you could make a game out of your imagination. It really, I think I borrowed it that night from him, and by the next morning I'd read the whole thing, and I was, saying like, we've got to get a game of this. We absolutely have to get a game tomorrow, basically. We did manage to play it, and sort of from then I was kind of hooked. And I never realised that. I mean, as I went to college and stuff, I played Warhammer and other RPGs. Call of Cthulhu was obviously a seminal kind of part of the experience as well. And I never thought that 30 odd years later that would be how I make a living now. Because for those of you who may not know, I'm sort of creative lead on the Achtung Cthulhu RPG from Modiphius, which is a sort of World War II Cthulhu crossover. And yeah, little did I guess that my kind of hobby was going to be my day job many years later. But I'd say it'd have to be D&D, but probably Call of Cthulhu is, the one that really captured my imagination. Any more?
Why Napoleon?
Why Napoleon? Yeah, I guess. Well, I worked on Achtung Cthulhu as a day job. I've always loved history. I've always been a real lover of history, and the Napoleonic age there's something about that really speaks to me. I don't know whether it's the kind of uniforms or the look, or things like Sharp or that great Waterloo film. And I just thought that would make a perfect setting for a kind of fiction series, and also an RPG, because I'm working on developing a Monju Cthulhu RPG. Look out for the Kickstarter next year, hopefully, fingers crossed. And well, as part of writing this, actually, I kind of thought, well, I've got to have to come up with a big overarching meta story and narrative that will sort of power that. But I think it's just the sort of the look and feel of that whole period, and also I think there's World War II, you can always shoot a gun and all that kind of thing, but especially the hero of this, get in there and use a saber as well. I think that is kind of a big influence. I loved Arthur Conan Doyle's Brigadier Gerard stories as well. And I thought that would be that would be the perfect thing to kind of bring into a fictional universe and cross it with Cthulhu and stuff. So yeah, I just love that period. That's probably the short answer. Okay, well, I see a few people following it. Any more for any more?
How did you get into RPG design as a job?
Oh, right. So that. By luck is the real answer. I used to be a video games journalist for many, many years. I was a video games journalist, and I used to work for GameSpot and a little publication called computervideogames.com, which is an online sort of video games news thing. And I got made redundant about 10 years ago from that, and I was sort of thinking, oh gosh, what am I going to do? And a friend of mine who I'd worked with on computervideogames.com, a guy called Chris Birch, he sort of went, oh, I'm starting this little role-playing game company called Modifius. Do you fancy coming and doing some stuff? I was like, oh, yeah, I could do, I suppose. So he was developing Acton Cthulhu, and I wrote some fiction for that, and I wrote a couple of scenarios to help with the launch and stuff. And I was like, wow, I've forgotten how much I actually enjoy games design and role-playing games design. And so, I'm always really narrative-led guy. I'm not a sort of mechanics guy, but although necessarily evil and all that kind of thing. But I think the two dovetail really neatly together, the sort of narrative and RPGs, and there's quite a lot of crossover. But yeah, it was literally just blind luck, I have to say. He said, oh, do you want to come on board and help out? And I was, yeah, I'm sold. Let's do it. And here we are a decade later, and I'm still doing it. It's crazy in some ways.
Fantastic.
Yeah. It just right place at the right time, I guess. Well, I think we're nearly time's up. So, quick one for anyone, or we'll call it there. Well, if you'd like copies of this or any of my other books, I'm down in the main hall. Personalised signed copies and everything, if you'd like those. So yeah, come down, and I'm always happy to chat in a bit more of an informal setting too. So thanks very much, and yeah, I'll see you down there.
Okay.
Cheers. Thank you. Oh, thanks for turning up as well. Obviously. Perfect.